Welcome. This is a presentation by the League of Women Voters titled Your Civic Superpower, Why Citizen Engagement Matters. I'm Peggy Creer. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County, and I'm here with Barbara Notstein, my colleague at the League, and someone who has a distinguished career in public service, including as a Wisconsin state legislator. And I'm also here with Sarah Feifel from the League, who's managing the Zoom. There's a quote by author Alice Walker that says, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And when I first read that, I immediately thought of voting and civic engagement. So tonight, in a quick half hour, Barbara and I hope to encourage you to harness your civic superpower and get involved in voting and civic engagement. And I'm going to begin by doing an overview, and then Barb will go more in depth, drawing on her experience as a state legislator. And afterwards, we'll open it up for discussion and questions for those who'd like to stay on. So first, a little about the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a grassroots, nonpartisan organization founded in 1920. That's the year the 19th Amendment, the Women's Voting Rights Amendment, passed. As a nonpartisan political organization, we don't support or oppose political candidates or parties, but we do promote informed and active civic engagement. And we research issues, and we advocate for public policies that serve the common good. And we encourage citizens to advocate for better government. This is reflected in the League's mission to empower voters and defend democracy. We're very active in advocating for voting rights and election integrity, of course, but we're also involved in environmental issues, particularly water quality and public infrastructure issues, and also policing reform and community safety are topics of interest to our members. I care about voter turnout. And last month, we had a primary election, and the turnout was 20.5% of Wisconsin voting age population. You may have seen headlines that touted this as a pretty great turnout for a spring primary, and that's true. But still, 3/4 of the people who could have voted didn't. So there's a lot of room for improvement. We let 1/4 of the citizenry elect officials who have a direct impact on the quality of life in our communities. And this is in Wisconsin, which is a high voter turnout state. We are consistently among the top 5 for voter turnout in the nation. So even though Wisconsin citizens do well, that leaves a lot of room for improvement. So even in national presidential elections, there's 20-25% of people who could vote who don't. And well over half, and sometimes more than 80%, Wisconsin citizens who could vote in local elections sit the election out. So we need to remember that elections in Wisconsin tend to be very close, generally decided by a couple of percentage points. So every vote is important. We're electing the people who speak for us when deciding public policies at the local, state, and national level. They make the laws that affect all of us. They spend our tax dollars and determine policy priorities. So your vote is your voice in these matters. And our democracy is stronger when voter turnout is higher. And our democracy then better reflects who we are as a nation. So who votes and who doesn't? Generally, the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. The baby boom generation has a consistent voter turnout rate of over 70%. Meanwhile, you get to the youngest generation of voters, 18-year-olds to 20-somethings, and their voter turnout for national elections is generally in the 40%, somewhere in the 40s, lately trending upward. So I think recently a little above 50%. So we know the baby boomer generation has a lot of political power. They're a big generation and they have high voter turnout. But the millennial generation is even bigger. But their voter turnout, as I said, lags behind that of their elders. So with like a 20-point gap in voter turnout, it's no wonder that the issues in national elections tend to be more focused on older voters. It's why you hear more about Social Security than you do about climate change. Turnout demographics affect priorities in elections. So why don't younger people vote in as high of numbers? It's always been that way. And I think apathy might explain a little bit of it, but it also reflects the diligence required to keep your voter registration up to date. You must register to vote every time you move, even if it's to an apartment across the hall in the same building. And younger people move more often. Also, college students in Wisconsin in particular have more onerous requirements. It's harder to come by proof of residence for college students if you share a house with a bunch of different people, you're renting a house for a semester. ID requirements can be more difficult for students because not all college IDs are acceptable valid IDs for voting. So the fact that in Wisconsin you can register and vote on election day is a big help to citizens. The reason often given by non-voters is that they think their vote doesn't matter, and there's so much proof that that's not true. One example, in April of 2022, there was a tie vote in Wauwatosa for an alderperson. It was decided by a provisional ballot. And a provisional ballot is the ballot given to somebody who shows up at the polls and they don't have their photo ID with them. So they fill out what's called a provisional ballot that is set aside, and they have 3 days to come back and show their ID, and then their vote will count. And so that election wasn't decided till that voter came back, and the provisional ballot decided the election. So it was a dramatic finish, and there are a lot of elections that are close. If you look at the election results in your local community, you might be very surprised, especially if you get down to school board or judicial races, and how few votes separate the two candidates. So now we're heading toward the 2024 presidential election. And it's good to note that we're a swing state and we're used to close elections anyway. The November 2020 presidential election was decided by less than 1%. So we see a number of TV ads placed by groups outside of Wisconsin during campaign season because we're a swing state. We're seeing them now with the state Supreme Court race, ads being placed by people outside of the state. And as we ramp up toward the 2024 presidential election, of course, we'll see a lot of that. It's a ton of money being spent by outside people who want to sway your one vote. So they know your vote matters. So if you know somebody who's a no-show, does not typically vote, please encourage them to claim their ballot as a right of citizenship. We've got 4 elections in 2024, 2 in the spring, 2 in the fall. And now's a good time to make sure you're registered and encourage your friends to do that too. I'm going to switch now and talk a little bit about citizen advocacy before I turn it over to Barbara Notstein. A lot of this information is in our citizen advocacy toolkit, which is on the League's website, and Sarah will drop the link to that into the chat. So we like to say your vote is your voice, which is absolutely true. But elections are relatively infrequent, and between elections, citizens can make their voices heard through issue advocacy. And even people who aren't eligible to vote can engage in advocacy to promote their views on government policy issues to their elected representatives. So I'm going to run through some bullet points, and they're in the citizen advocacy toolkit on our website. But these are things that people or organizations should consider when they're engaging in citizen advocacy. First, of course, would be identifying a public policy issue. That's the easy part. If you're going to engage in advocacy, you already know what your issue is. But then identifying goals. And for example, is your goal just to raise awareness about an issue? And if so, among whom? Who's your audience? Is it the general population, an elected official, a certain governing body like a school board? Is your goal to change a law or government policy? And if so, which level of government? Is your goal to motivate citizens to change behavior, like drive slower in a school zone because of concern for pedestrian safety, that sort of thing? And after you've decided on your goal, then you can start thinking about strategy considerations and some options for taking actions. I'm going to list some actions that the League typically takes when doing their advocacy. One is a statement at public hearings. writing letters to the editors and including others to do the same, organizing grassroots lobbying, which Barbara will talk much more about. You could put on some sort of public forum to educate the public or your audience about an issue. You can issue a press release about it or try to get press coverage for a newsworthy event, like putting on some kind of clever rally with a clever theme to attract attention. And of course, social media outreach. Factors to consider when you're contemplating action on an issue and you're working as part of an organization is thinking about, would your members understand the issue and would they agree with the proposed action? Is it a priority for your organization? Can you get support by your members? How would you deal with controversy? Because pretty much any issue is a little controversial nowadays. Does the action you're proposing have some chance of success? Or even if it doesn't, does it make an important statement about your organization? What action techniques would be most effective? And how can individuals be involved in the proposed action? When you think of your members, would they get involved in a river cleanup? Or are they more likely to do phone banking or the other way around? Would they show up at an event? Would they show up at an event if it were outdoors and in January? So different things to consider. Individuals who are interested in issue advocacy should consider joining an organization because of strength in numbers. And established organizations could consider joining a coalition or forming a coalition for the same strength in numbers. There are advantages to working with others on a specific issue. It's easier when it comes to sponsoring meetings and events to have more people involved to do the work. In researching an issue and producing informational materials, in organizing marches and public advocacy, because you have easy access to the other organization's participants. Factors to consider when joining a coalition include, is there a clearly defined goal and is it consistent with your organization's objectives and positions and mission? Which organizations are involved and who's their leadership? What is their perception in the community? Is the organization nonpartisan, if that's important to you? Is the coalition permanent or ad hoc? What would your organization have to gain from belonging? Could you work more effectively outside the coalition and yet publicly supporting its goals and actions? Would you have a representative on the coalition and have some control over the use of your name and logo? Is there a financial obligation? So there are lots of considerations before you devote time, energy, and maybe even money toward advocating on an issue. And before I turn it over to Barbara, I just want to say a word about failure. It's possible to do everything right and still fail in the area of issue advocacy. I think of the issue of having a goal to reduce gun violence. If you ask yourself sort of the things that need to be in place that would help you succeed, one would be, is there public awareness about the issue? Of course. Is there passion around the issue? Absolutely. Is there an organized coalition or effective organizations working on it? Yes, and we can all name some of them. We even have public polling showing support, broad public support for some of the measures that are being advocated for, like universal background checks. And yet it hasn't happened yet, despite strong advocacy for many years. Why? There's the influence of money in politics, gerrymandering, there are reasons for it, but the alternative is silence, and that would be worse. So I'm going to turn it over now to Barbara Notstein. She served in the Wisconsin State Assembly for 14 years. She also has been executive director of Safe and Sound and of the Hunger Task Force of Milwaukee, and she's going to share her advice on effective advocacy.
Thank you, Peggy. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold, so I may rasp a little bit. I apologize for that. Excuse me. I have been both a policymaker, as a state legislator and an advocate working for a couple of nonprofit organizations. And in many ways, they are two sides of the same table. I learned a lot from being an advocate. I also learned as a policymaker that the role of advocates, of constituents, is extremely important to, at that time, my ability to do my job well. So Peggy was talking about the importance of voting, and that's step one in ensuring that we have a democracy. But the other part of it is that people must participate in the policy making and the lawmaking process if we are also to have a good democracy. Having informed participation in that lawmaking process can make a big difference in the outcome of whatever policy is made. Good policy comes from consideration of research, of the opinions of constituents, the opinions of nonprofit organizations, and yes, lobbyists. They can actually be very helpful, and personal experiences that people can relate that pertain to the topic that's under consideration. By contacting and communicating with policymakers, you are actually helping them do their job. I know sometimes people will think, oh, you know, I hate to bother the person, and, you know, they're really busy and all that sort of stuff. But the reality is they need your input. They will do their job better if you provide input. So the first step in all of this, and you all may know this already, but is, first of all, to identify the issue you're working on and know what level of government will have a decision-making role in determining what policy affects that issue area. And then you need to find out who represents you. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. And Sarah, if you could please put this in the chat. There's a website that you can go to where you can find out the names of all of the people who represent you and create public policy in your name. And that site is myvote.wi.gov. So that's myvote.wi.gov. And Peggy just put it in. Thank you. And you'll see there that once you're at that website, there's a link for inserting your own voter information, meaning your address. And when you do that, you will have a list of every single person who represents you in our government, from the president all the way to your member of your city council or your village board or the school board. And all of those people, with the exception of judges, are people who can be and should be influenced by the opinions of their constituents. So it's important that you contact them. I want to talk now about some strategies for influencing these policymakers. I have my own kind of personal rule of thumb, and you can decide whether or not you think it's valid. To some extent, the success of a mode of influence really depends in some part on the extent to which the communicator, the constituent, has put an effort into providing that information, meaning that if you sign a petition, somebody sticks a petition in front of your face and you sign it, that really doesn't require a lot of effort or a lot of thought. And quite frankly and bluntly, unless there's thousands and thousands and thousands of signers, they don't really make any kind of a difference. But if you send a letter or you send an email and it's well crafted and well thought out, you can have influence. And I would encourage people to do that. It's important, unless you're a lobbyist or you're working with a very large organization, it's important that you communicate with the people who represent you. They're going to care what you, as their voter, thinks about an issue, or they should care. I'm not saying that they all do. Sometimes I hear that elected officials don't respond, aren't helpful, whatever, but they should care. And if you write a well-crafted email or a letter, meaning that you stick to one issue per communication, You tell them your home address so that they know you live in their district. You provide personal examples and stories about how an issue will affect you. Is it a healthcare issue where you've had experience with that type of healthcare, or is there PFAS in your community affecting your water, or have you had someone in your family who's been incarcerated? I mean, there's a myriad of ways in which we're all impacted by proposed public policy, and it's important, if you can, to include that in your communication. If you don't have personal experience with it, don't let that stop you from communicating. It's important that you do so in any case. Excuse me, and be sure to tell them what action you want them to take. Are you asking them to introduce a bill, sign on as a sponsor of a bill, oppose a bill, add an amendment to a proposal that's moving forward, sign a bill into law if it's the president or the governor? You want to tell them what it is you would like them to do. And I recommend asking for a reply. You don't necessarily get one, but you at least establish the expectation that you are hoping and expecting to hear back from them. Another very effective way to communicate with elected officials is clearly to meet with them. You can ask to meet with them in their office. You can ask to meet with them somewhere in the community. If you're dealing with state legislators, you may end up meeting with a staff person. That's okay. Especially state senators have large staffs, and they are people who are very knowledgeable and very capable and will communicate your information to the elected official. If you go with a group of people, make sure that at least one or two of the members of the group is a constituent of that person and can say that they are, and talk about where they live. It's important that you leave information, written information. If they ask you something you don't know, tell them you don't know, but that you'll get back to them, and then always follow up. And thank them for the meeting when you're there. And then afterwards, follow up with a thank you note. You could be an email or a letter, if people still do letters. I like to do them. But in any case, use that as an opportunity to reiterate your points and tell them again why you think what you think and why it's important. But thank them for taking the time to meet with you. Another very important part of influencing public officials is participating in public hearings. Sometimes the public thinks that public hearings aren't useful to participate in, and that they're not valuable, and that the policymakers have already made up their minds. Sometimes that's true, but often it's not true. I will tell you that as a lawmaker, I found the public hearings that when I sat on a committee and people came and spoke and left information about their issue, I found that information extremely helpful, and it often went into crafting amendments to bills that were proposed by the ideas that the public came up with at those hearings. They were very, very valuable. Sometimes the information that people provided at a public hearing will not only be used for amendments, but it'll be used in debates on the issue when it comes before the whole legislative body. I remember when I was on a committee, and this was quite a while ago now, but we took up a bill that I was opposed to that was the first ban on gay marriage in Wisconsin. And there was a church pastor who got up and spoke very eloquently about how his church dealt with gay and lesbian people. And I used that in one of my speeches because it was so profound and so eloquent and persuasive and emotional. So that kind of participation in public hearings can be very, very helpful. Usually, although not always, and I'm most familiar with the legislature, although when I was at the Hunger Task Force, I did deal extensively with the school board in Milwaukee and the county board. The committee will create a record of what has been discussed at a public hearing. And that will be available for the policymakers to review and use for garnering information about their position on an issue. Following the public hearing, if the chair of the committee desires, there will be a vote on the issue. And this is an opportunity prior to that for you to contact your member of the committee, if you're represented by someone on the committee, or ask your legislator or county board member to communicate your concerns to some of the other members of that committee. And then there's a vote, and then after there's a vote, always, whether it's a common council, village board, school board, the legislature, Congress, after a bill or a proposal goes through a committee, then it must go through the full legislative body, whether it's a county board or in the Wisconsin legislature, there's 2 houses of the legislature. And that's an opportunity to exercise influence. And then it goes to whoever the executive is, whether it's the mayor, the county executive, if you have one, or the governor of the state of Wisconsin. Now, there are municipalities that don't have an executive, and I haven't lived in one of those, but I do believe that once something is approved by the village board, it becomes the policy of the village and doesn't have to go to someone to sign. The other thing that Peggy mentioned in passing is that the media can be very, very helpful. Letters to the editor, providing information to writers who might be interested in your issue. The papers that still exist often have reporters that are assigned certain levels of government, and sharing that information with them can be very helpful to your cause. I want to talk just a little bit more about effective contact with lawmakers. I said before that you need to identify yourself and your home address so that they know that you're a constituent, and you need to do that whether you're emailing, writing a letter, or texting, or making a phone call. You always want them to know that you're a constituent, and that you expect, in a polite way, that the information you're providing will be communicated to the policymaker. If it's at all possible, use a bill number or the name of a proposal. Describe, and I mentioned this before, how a proposal affects you. Is it you personally, your family, your neighborhood, your school's teachers or principals? How is this piece of policy going to affect your lives and the things that you care about in your life? Put a human face on that. The best testimony that I ever heard was from people who were able to come into a hearing and talk about how something affected their family. And it was, based on their knowledge about the policy, but it was also based on, this is how this is going to affect me as your constituent, and I live here and I need you to understand and listen to me. It's always helpful, if you can, to very politely address the counter arguments. If you know what the opposition is saying, and you have thoughtful ways of countering that, you can't say things like they don't know what they're talking about, even though you think that. But give your reasons and give the research and make your best argument about why what the other side is saying is not true, is incomplete, is partly true, but not totally true, or whatever you think it happens to be. And as I mentioned, in your communications, stick to one issue. Don't send a letter or an email that deals with 3 different things. Send 3 different emails, although maybe don't do them all on the same day. So be brief, be courteous, communicate using a 1-page letter or email, if you even need be that long, and be as courteous and as polite as you can possibly be. So I'm going to stop now. There's a lot more I could talk about, but we're at about the halfway point here, and I want to give anyone a chance to ask questions or comments, or tell us about your experiences if you have them. I just want to say one other thing, and that is that I've heard from any number of people that they will write to or email their office holders and they sometimes don't get a response. I will just say that I think that is unprofessional on the part of the office holder. It is even rude. There is nothing the matter with them writing you back and saying, well, thank you for your letter supporting blah, 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 but I happen to oppose it, and these are the reasons why. You should be able to expect a response. So you need to do the best you can to communicate, and if nothing else, they'll read what you have to say. So, questions or comments or?
Barbara, I kind of have one. It's when I call, let's say, an assembly person, and of course you get a staff person, and you say who you are and why you are for or against some proposal. And they get off the phone quick. Thank you for calling, that's it. Are they required to note the number of callers they get on one side or another of an issue?
That would depend on the policies of that office. The office holder is in charge of that, and he or she will ask the staff and tell the staff to do what they want. Good policymakers will want to know how many calls they got or letters they got on one side or another. When I was in the legislature, and this is still true, we had bill files, and what they were manila files with a bill number on it, like AB 495. And when I got letters or phone calls from people about a particular issue, my staff would tell me about it, but they would also insert it in the bill file. So when that bill came up, in committee or on the floor of the assembly, I would be able to look in that file and see, that's a good argument that person made, or gee, and we would respond to all of them. They would get a letter back or a phone call back, or however they chose to communicate. But how an office responds is entirely up to the office holder. Okay.
And I have heard that remarkably few people bother to contact legislators on an issue. Can you comment on that? And I see Lorna has her hand up too.
Yeah, I guess I would answer in two ways. One is that I don't think that it takes an enormous number of letters or emails or phone calls to have an impact. I don't mean that you'll necessarily change the lawmaker's position, but if they get 15 communications about something, and that's an assembly district, that's a fairly large number. What was your question again? I'm sorry, I'm spacey.
No, you just answered it.
Okay.
I think my question was a little similar to that, in that if you know that your legislator does not agree with you, I mean, you just know they don't, is it worth writing a letter to state your position?
Yes. You don't want, I remember several years ago when a bill dealing with the rent-to-own industry was being debated on the assembly floor. One of the legislators from Milwaukee who was supporting the bill, and it was a bill that would have done great damage to his constituents, he got up on the assembly floor and said, I haven't heard from anybody on this. I don't think they're concerned about it. And you never want a policymaker to get up and say, nobody's told me they oppose this. Nobody's given me any reasons why I should oppose this or support it. It's very, very important that people communicate. And I know you don't always get a response, but it's really important to do that. And good lawmakers will pay attention to what they're being told.
Yeah, I was in a meeting with a local lawmaker, and he said that his colleagues in Madison say, we don't hear anything about climate change. It is not top of mind to our constituents, but I'm sure it is to younger people especially. And it speaks to what you said, Barbara. It pays to speak out.
Yes. And if you don't, then they honestly don't know what people out there think.
Mhm. All right, is there, Sarah, is there something in the chat?
The only thing we have is in the chat is that Katie had, she appreciated the
Oh,
talk.
yes,
She just had a drop off.
I see that. All right, well, thank you for coming, and please visit our website to see our advocacy toolkit and to learn more about the league or to find information on voting. Please spread the word about this very important election that's coming up April 4th. You can still request an absentee ballot at myvote.wi.gov, and you can begin voting early on March 21st. And please stay civically engaged after the election as well. Thank you, and thank you, Barb. Thank you.
Thank you.